Hello and welcome. My name is Svetlana Stone. You are watching and listening Artist Voices, where we believe it's essential for artist voices to be heard. And we are pleased to have three generations of musicians to talk about what does it take to be a musician in the 21st century. And I would like to introduce our guests. Here we have Igor Fedotov. He is a professor at Western Michigan University School of Music. And I would like to ask, how was your day? And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, the day is beautiful because it's finally warm outside. Spring is here. But myself, I'm professor of viola. I'm a chair of string department at Western Michigan University School of Music. With me today, other two guests. They my one of current student and one of my former student. If you allowed me, I can give a couple of more words about both of those students, and I think then you will understand why we all three of us here today. Olga Zabrikova, who is one of my first student here at Western. She's a violist in Grand Rapids Symphony now. Olga also have a large private studio, and she used to live in Kalamazoo. And while she was here, she had a student with the name Sava Velkov, who is also with us today. And Olga left to, when she got a permanent position at Grand Rapids Symphony, she moved to Grand Rapids Symphony and asked to take Sava to my class, which I did with pleasure. And Sava, current Western Michigan student, and she's finishing her undergrad this year. And she's finishing with the Flushing Colors.
Are you going to finish this year?
Yes.
This semester.
That's, I mean, like in April.
Yes,
April
like I
30th.
have about a month
exactly.
left. Yeah.
This is her last semester, and she's a winner of concerto competition this year.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And she will be
Congratulations.
performing, Sava, remind me, is it 23rd of April?
April, yes.
Yeah.
April 23rd at 8 p.m.
Exactly, April 23rd at 8 p.m. in the Miller Auditorium. Our student symphony orchestra will be performing concert and will be featuring Sava as a soloist with the orchestra. So that's a grand finale
Yes.
for Sava. So as you see, there's a three generation of violists here, and I think it makes sense to talk about a musician, not only about myself, but actually about what I'm teaching, the products of, if you wish, of mine, which I'm very, very proud of.
So, like you said, there is a three generations of musicians, which is great. Can we start with you? Tell us how you become a musician.
My mom took me to the to the music school, and but seriously speaking, my father, who was not a musician, but he was, as I've heard from my mother, because I don't remember my dad. He died when I was 1 year old in a car accident. But he always wanted to be a musician, yet he was a marine engineer. But he was a terrific whistler. Back in the end of 50s, whistling, artist whistling, what they called it, was extremely popular. And from my mother's story, he wanted to go to study some sort of music at the public conservatoire. He went there and they asked, "What instrument do you play?" And he said, "I don't play anything. I can whistle." He said, "Okay, what do you whistle?" He said, "Tchaikovsky violin concerto."
Can he seriously do that?
Seriously, it was a serious incident. So finally, when he died, my mother decided that I should be a musician. That's how I became a musician. Very simple. Not necessarily it was easy move for me. I like many other things, but at the end, I ended up to be a musician.
And where are you originally from?
Well, originally I was born in city of Baku, which is Azerbaijan. It used to be part of Soviet Union. Part of my family moved after Second World War there because of the hunger, but most of the people stay in Moscow. So I've always been dividing between Baku and Moscow, back and forth, and finally ended up to marry and live in Moscow before I came to United States. So,
Thank you so much for sharing.
thank you.
And I'd like to continue with you, Olga. Tell us your story about yourself and how you become a musician.
My story isn't very different from what Igor was talking about. So I started playing violin when I was 6, and it was a pretty interesting process because I remember the entrance exam in the music school really well, like it was yesterday. So you walk into this room where there's a bunch of very scary women sitting around, and I had to sing a little song, and then you had to clap a rhythm to repeat whatever they were doing, and then they also look at my hands, and they looked at my fingers, saw how long they were, and they saw how far I could stretch, and so they recommended that I play violin. So violin wasn't necessarily my instrument of choice, but I was recommended to play violin. So I did. And it was an interesting process because I loved performing. I loved being on stage and wear beautiful dresses and shoes. I didn't necessarily like practicing, but I really loved performing. So I think the idea of being sort of like a star was really appealing to me. And I stuck with this. And then my dad was not a professional musician, just like Igor's, but he had a pretty amazing tenor voice, and he knew a lot of classical players in the city, and so a lot of them would come and play little chamber music things in our house. And one night I saw a viola player, and I just fell in love with that instrument, and that's why I switched. And then the rest is history.
Thank you so much. And Sava, can you share us your story?
My story is just a little bit different because I wasn't quite young when I started playing viola, which is my first instrument and really only one at this point. But I started in my elementary orchestra program around 4th grade when I was 9 years old. And I chose viola just because on the sheet they had violin, viola, cello, and bass. And I've heard of course, violin and cello. And I was like, I've never heard of this in-between instrument, viola. Like, it seems so mysterious and like interesting. So I chose that one, and I just stuck with it through my elementary and middle school education. And then in middle school, I started really just enjoying playing. And my orchestra teacher noticed that I was like excelling a little bit more than my peers and recommended me to start taking private music lessons, where I met Olga as my first teacher. And then, yeah, I studied with Olga, and then I studied with Professor Fedotov, and then now I'm here, about to graduate.
Are you originally from Kalamazoo or from different area of Michigan?
I'm originally from Kalamazoo.
From Kalamazoo. And you, Olga, from Grand Rapids, right?
Well, I'm originally from Moscow.
Originally
now I live in Grand Rapids.
In Grand Rapids. And can you tell us a little bit, what are you doing there in Grand Rapids?
I'm a viola, a section player in the Grand Rapids Symphony. I got that job 20 years ago, and so it's been a wild ride. It's pretty exciting to be part of the full-time symphony, where on any given week you can sometimes play 2 or 3 different programs depending on what's going on at the time. And just the thrill being on stage in front of a couple of thousand people, and them all getting up at the end and screaming and being as excited as you are. It's pretty exciting life.
You want to add something?
Wonderful. So you succeeded in your dreams, right? Became
yeah.
a superstar.
Oh, of course. And and I still get to wear beautiful shoes. And dresses.
And how is that for you, being professor and see your not just students you see here in studio, but success that they are experiencing? They become like successful musicians. And how is it for you to see Olga and then Sava? She's going to graduate in April. What do you feel?
And many more. more students, my former students I see, more I feel older. I guess. Seriously speaking, I think I'm proud of them. And it's just before we start interview today, we talk about how strangely, interestingly, your students, they image stamped in your mind once and forever. Like, for instance, when I look at Olga, she's still like a 25 years old for me, look like, despite of age, because and it probably happened with every student. Probably Sava in 40 years from now, if I survive, she'll be still in my, when I look at her, I will still see 15 years old, 17 years old when she joined my class. That's kind of strange, but many more students was in the class, and I really look at them. We keep in touch, and I don't know what to say. It's a part of life. It's they like kids. They come to your class 4 years later, they're gone. You have another one. It's like a conveyor going. But I really like what they keep in touch, practically all of them.
Well, we are here to talk about what does it take to be a musician in 21st century. What does it take for you? You can start from.
Well, it's probably a question to Sava, I guess, because she'll be a musician in the 21st century.
I guess that's true. Yeah, as I go through and think about my career, the first thing, of course, is just practice, right? Because the performance is really nothing if you don't practice. And it's a little stressful, too, if that comes down to it.
Talk about stress. How much stress, you experience when you work on the program?
Usually, I don't feel really stressed when I'm working or practicing on the program, but then when the deadline starts coming up, it's you just want to put your best sound out there. I don't want to only give half of my effort. I want to try and do my best. And so as the deadline is coming up, I have my recital coming up soon. I do start to get stressed, and it gets a little heavy thinking about what if all these things go wrong? But then you have to kind of reassure yourself and take a step back and say, well, if I do my practice now and I keep sticking to it and kind of just, I don't know, keep pursuing this as I know I should, then I can just rely on myself and trust at the end of the day that it will be okay. But stress is definitely just part of the process in general,
I think stress always was and will be part of the
part of being a
performing
musician
process. Yeah, whether you're a 21st century musician or 20th century
Exactly.
musician, it's all depend how you deal with the stress. The most important for us how you could cover stress, because it's impossible to not have a stress and feel absolutely comfortable on stage. I remember one of the masterclass of when a famous viola teacher running masterclass asked a student who was playing for her. The teacher was Karen Tuttle. She is probably the most incredible viola American viola teacher that unfortunately passed away some years ago. And during that masterclass, when a little girl finished the play for her, she asked her, how you feel? Are you nervous? And that little kid turned on her, staring at her rock face, said, no. And she looked at her again and said, oh, so not at all? She said, never ever. And you know what Karen Tuttle said? I remember still, like a 20-something years later. She looked at her for a second and said, I'm so sorry about you. That's the point. Because if you, what is the stress? And the stress we have during performance because we really wanted to deliver you. We really feel we want to deliver you the best as possible. So we feel that responsibility on our shoulders, responsibility up to absolutely final detail. Do not make one note wrong. And if you look at the music, if you simply try to count how many notes do we play during, like, say, 1.5 hour concert, it probably will be several thousand. So to master every note precisely, and what for a string player, note is the position of your finger on the fingerboard. If you simply move finger for maybe 1/16 of an inch forward, you have a wrong note. You have wrong intonation.
Wow.
Think about it, several thousand of finger positions with such precision to meet. It's incredible pressure. So we learn through the life how to not to have a stress. Stress is a part of the process. It has to be there. But how to cover stress that the audience will not see it. And that's the real task. And everyone deal with this very individually. Some musician, and I wouldn't mention name, but I know they taking pills before to calm them down, which I think it's a really awful idea because that diminishing that stress, but it also diminishing your sensitivity, the emotional sensitivity, and that's really trouble for a performance because performance is not about correct wrongs or correct or wrong intonation or finger placement, so on. It's about feelings. So that's the most
Deliver
important.
message, yeah.
Exactly. If you lose that emotional sensitivity, if your emotions are down, you're not going to deliver really performance what audience expect from you, even if you play all the notes are precisely. So that, and finally, if you don't mind, if there's two ways, in my opinion, to deal with the stress. You could fight with this, or you could just go with it and learn how to live with it. Because if you fight with the stress, you have to remember you're fighting with nature and the physiological nature, and the emotional nature, and the psychological. And it's incredibly hard. It's if you simply imagine that you're crossing rushing river, and to fight with that power almost impossible. So if you want to survive, sometimes it makes sense to swim with that rushing river because at some point, somewhere down the stream, it will take you to one another coast. You say you might survive, but if you fight with this, you might not. So the same thing with stress. If you simply learn how to swim in that stressful situation, I think you will be better off. But it's very hard to learn.
It is very hard. I agree. Once I'm a musician myself, and I also like dealing with stress. And I remember I was very nervous about my performance, and the best advice I ever was given by other musician, um, basically, just be yourself and enjoy what you are doing. Do your best. Like you mentioned something like that. You said what you can do. You can nervous, or you can just flow and just like jump to the ocean of music and deliver and do your best. I mean, I think it was the best advice I have ever received. That it's just give me a power not think about notes, right or wrong, but just enjoy and deliver
Yep,
music to others.
exactly.
What do you think, Olga?
About stress?
Yeah, about
How about being a musician in 21st century?
jury,
Oh,
or if you want to add something to what we
Oh.
just discussed.
I don't know. I got lost. Started thinking about rushing river and surviving that. Igor is absolutely
true.
right. This is the best advice. Because sometimes, when you get sort of on edge a little bit, you just have to kind of get into that feeling and just instead of fighting it, you just have to go
Yeah.
with it. And eventually
Yeah.
it just goes away. You start thinking about something else. So, and with music, it's interesting because none of the other art forms, I think, experience other artists experience what we experience. Because I will compare that with visual art, for example, sculpture or painting. It's really not quite the same. I don't think maybe they have their struggles as artists, but the that element of stress is not quite the same because what we do is very unique. And think about that. So let's say you went to the concert and you hear this beautiful piece of music. You don't just experience it right there. You will continue having that experience go with you home. You're going to have it for a few days afterwards. And I feel like with visual arts, it's not quite the same. You have a little bit more palpable understanding of their art, like right there, but it doesn't really stay with you.
Yeah. No, and it's true. And as I said before, it is very individual. I know some people. I remember one the student of mine. I wouldn't mention name. It was in the past. She could not hold the bow. It was start jumping, and she couldn't just simply figure what's happened with her body. Whole body was start shaking, and she got to stop. Um, but then when we analyzed that with her, I just incidentally kind of momentum idea came in mind, and I said, listen, um, try to when you go on stage think about how long you will be on stage. So it's 15 minutes, for instance. Well, with the students, usually it's part of performance. It's shorter performance than professional 1.5 hours or 2 hours. So I said, well, if you perform 15, 20 minutes, just think about the fact that in 20 minutes it will be done.
That's
That will
true.
be finished. That's it. You see? So if she said she was experienced for a day before, she couldn't sleep. I said, well, finally, just be happy because it's only 20 minutes left. See,
Yeah, that's
helped her.
It does
She
help.
went with that feeling and she came back and said, oh gosh, I'm done with this. Thanks God. And it really worked for her. Not necessarily will work for everyone. It's obviously, but that's a very, very individual process.
It's another great advice to follow.
Yep.
It's just 20 minutes or an hour of performance, right?
Right.
Well, when it's, I mean, you have to admit that 15 minutes is much better than 2 hours being on
True.
stage.
That's
Right.
It's a little
But
bit.
on a sense, in the contradictory what you said, sometimes you have a rush first 15, 20 minutes and then you're going to the second half of the performance and you
That's
already warmed up. Not only warmed up, you kind of stressed out. I think the most important to get contact with the audience whom you play for.
For those of you who just tuned in, we are here at Public Media Network with amazing, wonderful 3 generations of musicians to talk about what does it take to be a musician in the 21st century. And again, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I would like to continue and learn more about what does it mean or take to be a musician. And I would like to start maybe with you, Sava. We speak about great advices and challenges that musicians face. One of them were anxiety. So, what do you think the biggest challenge that musicians are facing today? And if something that you experience as well.
Right. One thing that comes to mind with that is relevant to like my experience right now in music school and studying music that one I've never heard before and like I've never experienced but I have all these recordings available to me and it's the idea of interpretation and honoring the composer's intentions versus honoring your emotional intentions with the music. Like I think to the music of Bach, for example, who was a Baroque composer. And whenever I listen to his music, I feel so emotionally engaged and I just want to like try and wring out as much emotion as I possibly can from it. And that speaks to my interpretation of like the solo cello suites, for instance. But if you listen to like great cellists like Pablo Casals, it's completely different. Like his interpretation is still emotional, but I mean, everyone's got their own interpretation at the end of the day, but some want to follow the traditions of Baroque era music, and then some people treat it more classically, treat it more romantically or modern and everything. And so it's kind of like a debate within yourself if you value your interpretation over what the composer was intending. And like, I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but this is like a challenge that I think is really present right now in the 21st century, dealing with music as a musician, So I wonder what you all think about this. And I don't know about Bach, for instance, but just in general.
Well, Bach especially, very, very, this discussion lifelong about how to interpret Bach. There's so many different components. First of all, Bach's music almost 400 years now old. So the aesthetics of that time were completely different than what I aesthetics of nowadays. I mean, when I say completely different, it's probably not even the very mild word, because many things during that time people accepted so differently, so we can't even imagine. So um, to replicate their emotions is incredibly difficult. So our own interpretation, our own involvement in the creation of that composition is very important. Although, so in other words, what I'm what I'm saying, what I wanted to say, that perfect stylistical interpretation is practically impossible. Though you could get very close to it using authentic instruments, for instance. Um, there's it's a very popular way of performing historical instruments, but still we are different aesthetically, emotionally. We're different people. We just simply not them. Um, I think I always Sava probably heard from me. What the musician role on the stage, in my opinion, we like mediums, because when we perform music that written 400 years ago, for instance, we're giving chance to those people to speak their soul and emotions through us. So when we go on stage and perform Bach, we have to somehow become a Bach himself and speak the language. So through us, those long time dead people speak to people in the audience. So we are in between. So we have to be artists and become them, at least for the time, which is difficult. At the same time, it's enjoyable, and it's always very hard to understand what is right, what is wrong, because in music, it's almost nothing right or wrong. It's all about your own feel about this music. So.
And when you do play like music piece, like do you do research before you start? Do you understand better what the composer?
Good musicians usually do. You must do it, because that's you have to be respectful to what's written, and understand. As I've said, it's not only that we have to perform the right notes and what's written in the score.
You also do a lot of reading, right, to learn.
Absolutely.
About.
It's a decoding their message, basically. As one of the very famous piano professor at Moscow Conservatory used to say, music that we perform, it's a coded letter for us that we have to decode. And in order to decode this, you really have to know a lot about the aesthetics, about historical movement, that person himself. Speaking about Bach, if you simply think about the person was twice married, 25 kids, not all survived. Besides, he had a duty to perform practically every Sunday and create music, to write music for it, and get an orchestra and conduct and perform himself. The scope of the duties, having such a large family, for instance, can you just imagine for a second what it takes? So, and then when you take Bach's letters that he wrote, you will see completely different side of that. When he just simply trying to beg for another extra penny for his work, so then nothing passionable and expressive. It's just all about calculation, how to survive and to get more money. So when you learn about this person, you suddenly realize that it's absolutely different mentality. It's a different people than us. It's a whole different world. So to understand his music, it probably would be at least as a starting point to understand how he lived, what he was thinking, what he did in real life. Try to understand that him as a person.
So speak about. Do you think, like we're living right now in 21st century, is it easy to be a musician now than back then? The difficulties that he was and challenges experienced and trying to survive 25 kids. Do you think, is it like the musician's life is right now is easiest?
I think it's always difficult. difficult. It's probably more difficult now, although it's very hard to judge. The life of a musician has changed so much, and I remember when I was a student, the category of musician was different than what we have now. Only like 40, 50 years later, the things are changed so dramatically. For instance, when we were a student, we were trying to be soloists because soloists had the more luxurious life, the best benefits, the most fame, um, and so on. Then the second category was the string quartet, which is the other very popular form. Those were four soloists together, and they were like a second tier of the most famous musician. Everyone would try to be there. And then the chamber orchestra, and finally, symphony orchestra. Now, in economic situation of nowadays, the things change practically upside down because the symphony, especially a large symphony orchestra, they are financially the most stable. So the biggest musician, the greatest musician, um, really wanted to be part of that financial security, so to say. And that's how symphony orchestra, from being fourth tier, now became a first. Um, yes, of course, for the soloists, the very high rank are still the most appreciated musician, the most famous, obviously, probably the most financially stable. Though I can't verify that, but I assume so. But a musician with a quartet or chamber orchestra, they can survive practically on their own, unless they're incredibly famous quartet. But it's a very, very hard life. So the things are changing. And, in order to the survival point, just answering now directly to your question, I think financially, it's the how to say that the financial aspect became or becoming more and more important nowadays in arts than it was before. That, in my opinion. So, what about Sava? What do you think?
I think finances are really important because, again, you want to try and live as comfortably as you can. And thinking on my experience, at least right now, as a student in college, I'm also in the Kalamazoo Symphony, the Battle Creek Symphony, and I'm teaching, and I have like another job on the side too. So while doing all of this, it doesn't, at least right now, where I am located, maybe doesn't seem like as sustainable as Professor Fedotov was saying, like in a top tier orchestra, or that's kind of like the goal, I guess, like as an orchestral musician, to try and be in a larger symphony that's more well known, rather than a lot of local ones, even though that's still like a valid way of living and everything, as I'm doing it right now. So,
and it's extremely hard, by the way, to get a job in really financially solid stay orchestras, like a AAA orchestra, like Chicago Symphony, New York Philharmonic. You face incredible competition. The spaces in orchestra open not as often as we wish. Sometimes you wait for 2 years, 3 years, even more years, sometimes to get the position open. And when it's open, you have for that only one position between 50 to 150 people staying on the line. And so you compete. Really incredibly difficult with such an army of excellent musicians. It's incredible.
Olga, like, go back to your dream to be a musician and perform shiny dresses. So, what do you still have the same passion,
Yes.
even though the challenges the musicians are facing?
I'm still excited to play. It doesn't matter what it is. I still feel the same way. It's a little bit different now because I've been doing this for a long time. So I have a lot of experience. I feel strong physically. So it feels great. But I still have that sort of excitement of music will still make my heart beat faster. That still happens.
It's excellent statement. I love it.
Interesting how aesthetics change nowadays. When we talk about now about this economical situation, how to survive financially, so on, so on, so on. I remember when we were a student, the symbolic words was, I don't know where this expression come from, but it said, talent must be hungry. Meaning, if you're hungry, you could create more. You could be very creative or more creative. I never heard that phrase during my last maybe 20 years because musicians think about differently now. Music became not only a passion, but in many cases, and probably most of the cases, unfortunately, it became money making, just life survival. That's what it is.
So I want to come back to the performances, anything that will come up soon. So you would like to share about, like we know that your graduation. Yeah, you will perform. What date is it again? What it is?
April 23rd.
It's going to be your recital.
This is a performance with the Western Michigan University Symphony Orchestra. It's basically like a showcase of the concerto competition that happened this year. So I will be performing. There will be a saxophone soloist with the orchestra and also a vocalist as well. And then we'll right, and then me as a violist. Yes, of course.
And how people can find information about you, Igor, and if you can share, that would be great.
It's on Western School of Music website, as well as I think it's publicized through Miller Auditorium, whatever they have their website and so on, because the performance is in Miller Auditorium, April 23rd, 8 p.m. But also, Sava performed a full final recital, senior recital, which is on April 8th, right? Sava,
yes,
do I remember correct?
Yes.
At 5
Friday,
p.m.?
After 5 p.m., exactly. Good.
We'll try to get there. And Olga, do you have a website or any information that...
Yes, the Symphony has a website. It's grsymphony.org. And we perform basically every week. All sorts of different programming for all sorts of tastes. We just did a movie, The Princess Bride. The whole 2 concerts. The hall was packed both times. I'm not a fan of the movie, but some people are. And then we're also doing one of the notable concerts to come is part of the Bach Fest. We're doing Be Minor Mass, which is talking about Bach. It's a fantastic piece, and I think anybody should experience that at least once in their life. And then at the very end of the season, we're finishing that with Mahler Symphony No. 2, which is an incredible music as well.
The Resurrection.
Yes. Yes. So please come.
Will do. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. It was great to learn about you, about your music, about what does it take to be a musician in 21st century. But even though it's challenging, but I can still see spark in your eyes. I see that you're in love with music, and this is so grateful. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining
Thank you,
tonight.
Svetlana.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
For having us.
Thank you. Thank you. So this concludes this episode of Artist Voices. We are so thankful for Igor and Sava and Olga for joining us tonight at Public Media Network, where we believe it's essential for artist voices to be heard. And thank you so much for watching us. And see you next time.